to the speakers, if we could have perhaps call in, are there any applications for new members, new membership?
There are none, but we have lots of members already.
Right, that's fantastic. That was we'd allowed 5 minutes for that, so we could be back on track. That's fantastic. So we've got three speakers. I'll just run through them. We've got Dr. Margaret Douglas. She'll be up first. She's from Public Health Scotland. She's going to talk about transport poverty, a public health perspective. And then after Margaret, we have Bertrand Dess, who's from France, but he works for Transport Scotland now. And he's going to talk about the Scottish Government actions to eradicate transport poverty. And then online, I see Ralph Hartley from the Poverty Alliance. Hello, Ralph, who's going to talk about transport poverty, rural and urban perspectives, and lessons from lived experience. I have told, well, the two people in the room, and the same message goes to you, Ralph, no longer than 10 minutes each. If you can come in under 10 minutes, you'll get a gold star. If you dare to stray over 10 minutes, I will be cutting you off. So with that message, we'll go straight to Margaret. So Margaret Douglas first.
Thank you very much indeed, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak this evening. I'm Margaret Douglas. I'm a public health consultant in Public Health Scotland, and I'm hoping Abigail will get my slides up. Thank you very much. Great. So what I'm going to talk about is a little bit about the background to some work that we've been doing on transport poverty. I'll talk about what transport poverty is, what causes it, what it means for health, why we're interested in transport poverty from a public health point of view, and then some recommendations that we've made. And so just to start off with a little bit of background about what affects health. I think very often when people ask themselves that question, what affects health, they think about health-related behaviours, diet, substances, perhaps health services. But actually the things that make the biggest difference to health are what we call in public health the building blocks of health. So that's things like good quality employment, access to education, good quality retail, social interaction. All of these things are what we call the building blocks, and they're the things that we all rely on to promote good health. And transport is one of those building blocks of health. So the piece of work I'm going to talk about, if my clicker works, oops, I'll probably go three in a row now. I hope you're not adding this to my 10 minutes or taking off my 10 minutes. Abigail, could you just press to the next slide, please? Because it's gone. Okay, so one of the things I do in PHS is I chair a group that's called the Public Health and Sustainable Transport Partnership. And this is a partnership that is definitely not just public health people. So several people in the room are members of this partnership. It has transport colleagues, it has people in the third sector, academia, as well as just a scattering of public health people like me. And we also have a data and evidence subgroup that makes sure that everything that we're doing is based on the best evidence. And our group exists to try and understand how transport affects health and try and inform local, regional and national transport policy in order to get the best outcomes for health and for health inequalities. So we decided over a year ago now that we really wanted to look at transport inequalities, and we did a piece of work where we looked at the literature. So we looked at what other people had done around transport poverty and transport inequalities, and we developed a definition and a model to explain transport inequalities, transport poverty, which I'll show you in a minute. We carried out quite a lot of stakeholder engagement, so we held some workshops and a number of meetings, including meetings of our partnership group, and we developed this definition and model. And we called it transport poverty, and I think when I come on to the definition, I think it's important to say that transport poverty is not just about money, it is much broader than that, and I'll show you the definition in a couple of slides. And we then produced a report, which I'm showing on the slide, which has our definition and model of transport poverty, why it matters for health, and some data to try and get a start of a handle on how important is it in Scotland. Ooh. So thank you. Thank you. So this is our model. It looks a little bit crowded, but I'm going to talk through the different elements of it. But this is just to show you what it looks like overall. So what we have in that blue lozenge in the middle is transport poverty. And in our report, we talk about the causes, the different things that cause transport poverty, and also how it influences health, all the different ways in which transport poverty can affect health. If I can have the next slide. Thank you. So this is our definition. So we felt it was really important. A lot of people talk about transport poverty and they think only really about affordability, and that is one really important dimension. But we define transport poverty as the lack of transport options that are available, reliable, affordable, accessible, or safe. Because there isn't really much point having low cost transport options if actually people can't use them because they're not accessible to their needs, or they're not reliable, or they don't feel safe on them. So we felt this multidimensional definition of transport poverty was really important: available, reliable, affordable, accessible, or safe, in order to allow people to meet their daily needs and provide a reasonable quality of life. So I'm going to talk through the different other elements of the model. If I could have the next slide, please. So to start off with the causes, I think we might obviously think about the transport system as a major cause of transport poverty. And certainly some of the things that cause people to be in transport poverty do relate to the transport system. They're about the kinds of ticketing that we have, or the non-integration of services, or the lack of information about services, or just non-availability of services. But it's not just the transport system. We also need the spatial planning system, which the way that we design places where very often where people live is distant to where they need to work, or where education services or other services are, can be a really big driver of transport poverty, and can lead to environments that are dominated by cars because there really aren't any alternative modes of travel. The way that we design public services can also be important, and that includes those of us that work in the NHS. Sometimes NHS services can be really inflexible. They can ask people to go to very distant services in different places that are really quite difficult to get to by either active or public transport, which means if you don't have access to a car, it's very difficult to get there. People's individual characteristics are obviously important, and I'll talk about the groups of people that are most likely to be in transport poverty in a couple of slides. But what underpins really all of these things is the car culture. So the assumption that we often have in our society that most people will have access to a car, be able to drive a car, and a lot of places and services are delivered on the assumption that people will be able to access them by a car, and that's obviously disadvantages the many people who live in a household that don't have access to a car. So if I could have the next slide. So all of these things are really important for health. So I talked about transport as one of the building blocks of good health, but it also enables us to access all of the other building blocks. So we need transport to access employment, education, retail, services, amenities. All of the things that we really rely on to promote good health are very difficult to access if you don't have suitable transport. If you're in a situation where you have to run a car because there's no other alternative, that has a big impact on your household budget. And there are many people who are in what we call forced car ownership, which means they because of where they live or where they work, there aren't really good alternatives to car travel. But that means it's taking a big hit on their household budget, and people on low incomes, that can really place them in financial hardship because of the cost of running a car. It can reduce access to healthcare as well as all of the other building blocks, so have a sort of double effect on health. And car-dominated environments that lead to people being in transport poverty also have many other adverse effects on health through pollution, through injuries from collisions, through community severance, all of the other adverse effects that we know a car-dominated environment has. And then finally, where people don't have suitable transport options, it reduces their impact, their ability to engage in community activities and to engage in influencing their local community. So that has a really big impact on health as well. So through all of these different pathways, transport poverty has a very significant negative effect on health. That can affect the individual traveller, their dependents, the rest of their family, and some of these impacts also affect the wider community. If I could have the next slide. So I said I would mention the populations most affected by transport poverty, and not surprisingly, one of those is people on low income. So people who are in financial poverty are more likely to find it more difficult to access transport that meets their needs. But also disabled people, who again are more likely to be in financial poverty, but also disabled people are much less likely to live in a household with access to a car, and very often report that other modes of transport are not accessible enough to meet their needs. So they're more likely to be in transport poverty. Women are more likely to have to make more complicated journeys, trip chaining to drop the kids off at nursery, then go on to school, then go to the supermarket on the way home. Those complicated journeys can be more difficult in active and sustainable travel, and means that transport services really need to be very flexible and well integrated to meet their needs. And women also often report feeling that less safe on both using active travel and public transport. So for all those reasons, they're more likely to be in transport poverty. And finally, rural communities where distances are longer, public transport services are often less frequent or not available at all to meet people's needs, and that can mean that people living in rural communities are more likely to be in transport poverty. They have higher levels of car ownership, but often that is placing people in financial hardship because that is, as I say, having a big impact on their household budget. So if I could have the next slide. In the report that our transport partnership produced, we made some recommendations. And the first one was to have a shared understanding of the dimensions of transport poverty. So it's not just about affordability, it's also about availability, reliability, accessibility, and safety. And when we first started doing this work, I think it was our intention to try and come up with a single index of transport poverty so that we could have a single measure that we could then have set as a target to reduce. But having done this work and looked at these different dimensions, we really feel that having a single measure is inappropriate. And one of our follow-up pieces of work is looking at indicators for each dimension of transport poverty. I think it's really important to increase awareness across sectors, and we made some quite high-level recommendations that were sectoral specific. So for transport, we really need to invest in sustainable transport options in both active travel infrastructure, but also good public transport options. For spatial planning to support the sustainable transport hierarchy, so people can have a genuine alternative to private car use. For service provision, that there should be more partnerships with transport providers to ensure that services are provided in a way that means that people are able to access them through active and sustainable transport modes. And that all sectors really need to take account of the diverse needs of different groups of people who have different needs from the transport system. And then finally, car culture, the kind of big elephant in the room. We really need more work to understand and address the car dependency that is leaving so many people without suitable transport options. So I've whizzed through that, hopefully in 10 minutes. I've got a last slide, I think, which has got the links to our report, which is on the Public Health Scotland website, and that's also the main website about transport and health, where you'll find other documents about how transport affects health and health inequalities. So thank you very much. Hopefully I've managed to do that within the 10 minutes.
Yes, allowing for that technical glitch, you came in bang on time. Can I just check everyone online heard that okay? Excellent, good. And we'll take comments and questions at the end. So I'm now going to turn to you, Bertrand. Sorry, Bertrand.
So I'm Bertrand S, working in the Climate Change and Just Transition Unit in Transport Scotland. So we are coordinating all the transport input to the forthcoming climate change plan. But also we are developing the also forthcoming Transport Just Transition plan. Finally, my team is responsible for the 20% car use reduction, and this cross-party group has worked on a report about reducing traffic, which was well received for us going forward. The recent IPPR report on transport in rural Scotland is spot on when it states the following: there has rightly been considerable focus on fuel poverty in recent years as a result of the cost of living crisis. Transport poverty has received less attention, but can have similarly life-changing impacts. and the intersection between fuel and transport poverty can be particularly challenging, introducing a double vulnerability. In addition to fewer transport options, people in rural areas are at greater risk of transport poverty due to what is called a rural premium that remote communities face. The rural premium describes how goods and services are more expensive in rural areas, something that has been exacerbated by the cost of living crisis. Here on the slide, you can see how this cost is varying depending on the groups, and the big red line is the average of £69 per week of transport cost per household. And you can see for some people, for example, the pensioner single or pensioner couple, people living in rural area have double the cost of their equivalent in an urban area. Transport poverty seen from the affordability point of view is clearly an important issue. However, it is difficult to measure its effect, as individual spendings on transport, unlike fuel or food, goes up as incomes go up. The Poverty and Inequality Commission noted that people on low incomes may have to restrict activities, limiting opportunities for work, education, or leisure due to affordability issues. Those who feel forced into car ownership, exactly like Margaret mentioned, still face the fact that fuel duty is at present a regressive tax relative to household income. My next slide will show you how the National Transport Strategy also tries to address the transport poverty through one of its 4 priorities, reducing inequalities, that you can see on the top of the slide, which highlights the action being taken to reduce inequalities. And on an annual basis, there is a delivery plan to show Scottish Government actions in reducing, in this case, inequalities towards achieving the vision of the National Transport Strategy, which is at the top and which is to be achieved by 2040. Next slide, please. As Margaret said before me, the Scottish Government has agreed with Public Health Scotland the wider definition of transport poverty, and we will imply this definition as the transport sector transitions to net zero. Distributing the cost and benefit of the transition in a fair way is a key aspect of the just transition from an individual and business perspective. And the draft Transport Just Transition Plan has proposed a transport poverty outcome, as shown on the slide, to eliminate transport poverty by 2045. Next. Now I will remind you on the first review in a few slides. It's helpful to remind you of the principles underlying this review, which were around ensuring the long-term viability of our public transport system and delivering recommendations that support our vision for the future of public transport. The review, published in March 2024, has considered both the cost and availability of services to ensure our public transport system is more accessible, available, and affordable, with the cost of transport more fairly shared across government, business, and society. As you can notice, the 3 A's cover almost all the aspects of the transport poverty definition. Next. The Fair Fares review has provided 2 sets of recommendations, immediate to short term and then medium to long term. So as part of the immediate to short term, you may have known about the 6-month trial to assess the benefits of removing ScotRail peak time rail fares that now has been double extended to end of September. It has the review confirms that we will maintain existing eligibility to the national concessionary travel schemes for those groups who currently benefit. The review highlights the need to prioritize measures to grow bus patronage, given bus is a mode of transport mostly used by people on low income who are more likely to face transport poverty. And Ralph, I think, will say in one of his slides more about that. The review sets out also a number of recommendations and actions specific to bus to deliver on our vision for the future of public transport. This includes project initiation plans for work on the bus service improvement plan and delivery framework over the next 18 months to improve availability of bus services. We will also consider options for a national bus or multimodal travel scheme and fare structure which could encourage more people to use bus and the wider public transport system, particularly when commuting. In addition, a fare freeze on the Clyde and Hebrides and Northern Isles ferry networks was in place until the end of March 2024 to help people and businesses from Scotland's remote rural and island communities. Next. We will develop options to better targeting of public funds towards supporting access to public transport for those who need it most, including consideration of concessionary travel support for those experiencing financial poverty. That should have been probably this one. Yeah. There is a recommendation to develop a proposal for a bus flat fares pilot for an area-based scheme to provide flat fares on bus travel or reduce fares on a zonal integrated travel for consideration in future budgets. There are a number of different ways this pilot could be developed. Detailed options will be considered with stakeholders. And this development work will ensure that any proposal for consideration is clearly aligned with the objectives of the Fair Fares review, but also affordable. So now more on bus. And my first bullet is about bus fares. To put things into perspective, the fares in Scotland have decreased by 12% in real terms, but when you look at in current price, they have risen by almost 8% over the past 5 years. Concessionary bus patronage, excluding under 22 bus use, has been at 73% of the pre-pandemic level so far in 2024, and was at 71% of the pre-pandemic level across the whole of 2023. All bus patronage is likely over 90% at the moment of the pre-pandemic level. Our firm commitment to bus continues with almost £430 million in funding for concessionary travel and bus services provided in the new financial year. This will see investment of over £370 million to support concessionary bus travel, funding of almost £50 million to help ensure our bus operators can continue to provide access to affordable transport through the network support grant, and around £6 million to continue our support for the community bus fund, which I will have a dedicated slide on later on. The Scottish Government has now delivered all the bus powers within the Transport Act 2001, which were amended by the Transport Act 2019, to enable local transport authorities to consider all the powers available to them, including partnership working, franchising, and local authority-run services, which sits alongside their ability to subsidize services. Now, my almost last slide is a on the community bus fund, which was introduced in 2023-24 to support local transport authorities to improve local public transport in their areas. The fund enables support to local authorities to help explore the full range of options set out in the Transport Act 2019. To date, the fund has helped support local authorities review local bus networks to develop local transport or bus strategies and complete options appraisals with a view to developing business cases. The fund was allocated £5 million capital and £750,000 resource funding last year, with a further £5 million and £1 million, both either capital and resource, for the new financial year. and last year, the way we allocated the capital funding was based on levels of transport poverty as defined by Sustrans way back to a report they did in 2016. So the allocation methodology was combining car availability, income deprivation, and access to services by public transport measure. And I think that concludes my briefing. In my last slide, you can get my email address, and please drop me any questions. I will try to answer them as quick as I can. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bertrand. I'm sure there'll be questions at the end based on that, but I'll go to our final speaker, Ralph Hartley from the Poverty Alliance. Ralph.
Okay, thank you. And hi, my name's Ralph. I'm the Policy Officer for Rural Poverty at the Poverty Alliance, but today I'm going to focus a bit more broadly on transport and poverty, as well as some focus on some of what we've heard from engagement with lived experience groups on this issue. And I think you'll probably notice a lot of similarities and shared themes, including some shared and sometimes worryingly slightly different statistics than what we've heard from Margaret and Bertrand. But my aim will be to frame some similar messages, but very much within the context of poverty more broadly, challenges faced by groups on low incomes, and sort of anti-poverty aims and policies. Can I just check, has that moved on for everyone? I get a thumbs up from someone. Yes. Okay, great. And I will actually skip that because I'm conscious of time, but we're the Poverty Alliance, we're Scotland's anti-poverty network. And if anyone's interested to hear more about us or isn't a member that thinks they should be, then please look us up. So I want to just start with two kind of framing points, which is first, that we know, and we touched upon this already in different ways, that low-income groups in Scotland and generally are less mobile. They travel less. So transport accounts for 14% of the average household expenditure. That's a UK figure. Yeah, 14% of the average household expenditure. But for the lowest income decile, it's 10%. And that's the opposite of what you see in other areas like food or energy, where expenditure on those areas is obviously a much higher percentage of income for that lowest income decile. For transport, it's much lower, which is telling us that we have a system which means that people in poverty are less mobile. And as Margaret showed, that means that they have limited and less access to all of the things that can help people escape poverty, whether that's employment, whether that's education, or whether that's social and cultural life. The second, and as Bertrand referenced already, is that low-income groups particularly rely on buses, and that isn't to say or suggest at all that other aspects of our public transport system, whether that's ferries, trains, or if we're talking more broadly about active travel, it's not to suggest they're not important, but that if we're talking about the experience of low-income groups and people in poverty and their relationship with public transport, buses is at the heart of that. So a quarter of people earning up to 15k a year use the bus to get to work, compared to just 4% of those earning 50k a year. And this is where the stats slightly differ, but I don't know if Bertrand, you've got a comment on this, but the figure I was referencing around bus fares and the increase in price there is 26% above inflation over the 10 years from 2010 to 2020. So, you can clearly see the impact that's going to have on people who rely on buses. And Margaret gave us a really, an excellent account of that broader picture for transport poverty, and in particular, I guess the way in which poverty, low incomes, play a part of a set of drivers of that broader picture of transport poverty, but they also feed back into poverty. So it's this cycle, although the diagram here is I've represented with a knot rather than a cycle. But that's to say that obviously clearly the relationship here between poverty more broadly and transport poverty, as Margaret set out, is really kind of inextricable and tight. And maybe this is for discussion or debate, but we would potentially argue that there's no such thing as transport poverty more broadly without that material fact underpinning it of poverty, whether that's poverty for individuals or poverty and deprivation faced by communities. Not accepting the complicating experience of rural Scotland there. However, I think for us it's really clear that approaches to transport poverty have to have anti-poverty practice at their heart. So in the long term, we can't solve transport poverty without some of those maybe more classic anti-poverty policies. So a focus on incomes, a focus on costs and affordability. But of course, the flip side of that is we can't build sustainable responses to poverty without ambitious reform to public transport. So focusing a little bit on some of what we've heard when we've engaged with groups of lived experience of poverty on this issue. And some of this fed into the Fair Fares review, and you can see the full report of the piece of engagement work we did as one of the appendices to the Fair Fares report, but also work we've done with the Scottish Government around just transition and movement away from car use. So yeah, for both of those pieces of work, we've worked with citizens panels both in rural and in urban Scotland to understand in depth their experience of transport in general, but obviously the public transport system in particular. And we work with urban and rural groups, obviously, because we anticipated differences in those experiences, and obviously there were differences in terms of the particularities. But I think it's worth emphasising that the fundamentals of what we heard from those groups was very similar, and in particular their aspirations and priorities for kind of a changed public transport system was really consistent. So very quickly, I might have to rattle through these a bit, but we heard a lot about reliability and a sense that current systems are not reliable. We heard very, very clearly from both groups that the need for an expanded and easily accessible concessionary schemes that would reduce costs for people that need it the most. We heard a great deal from everyone we spoke to about a lack of safety and how perceived or real lack of safety was a key barrier, and in particular a barrier for women and girls, disabled people, and Black and minority ethnic people. So we heard a lot about experiences of sexual harassment and abuse on public transport, leading to an understandable reluctance to use public transport. So just like we can't tackle transport for people in low incomes without a focus on buses, we would also argue they can't think about buses and public transport more broadly without thinking about the particular experiences of women, girls, disabled people, and Black and minority ethnic groups. Obviously, we also heard a lot about accessibility for disabled groups and young women with prams. And we heard really strongly that people felt that people living on low incomes should continue to be involved in policy making and service design. And obviously, there was a great opportunity through the Fair Fares review, but that people felt that as the group that uses public transport the most, they needed to have their voices sort of continually heard in a sort of structural way in policy making around public transport. I won't go through all these quotes, but we'll make sure we share these in the report with the group so people can access some of that sort of richer stuff that sits behind in terms of what we heard from people. In terms of our broader work around car use, unsurprisingly, people were really clear that ambitions to reduce car use were only going to work if there was really substantial, ambitious, and in some cases probably radical work around public transport. And we particularly heard that, of course, from rural groups, as we've already talked about today, for some of whom use of cars is not just necessary, but a matter of survival. So yeah, all participants that we worked with when we were focusing on this issue of car use felt that significant improvements would be required to public transport if these goals were to succeed without negatively impacting on vulnerable groups. Yeah, but an interesting theme came around sort of the way that these policies are talked about, and a real sense that there needed to be, as some of the participants put it, a balance of the carrot and the stick when it came to any sort of policy change around trying to move people away from car use, and just, I guess, better work around educating people in that space. And again, obviously similar themes around cost, affordability, reliability, and safety. So in terms of our policy asks as an organisation, as a network that has come through and come partly as a result of that work with lived experience groups. Oh, sorry, actually, wrong slide. I've got rural. So obviously we've already heard, and Bertrand's stats, which I'll be stealing because I think they're more up to date than mine, we've already heard about that additional impact in terms of the cost for rural communities. Transport is the most significant additional cost. So, you know, that rural premium that Bertrand talked about, transport really is, you know, the biggest chunk of that. And obviously over here I've got £50 a week, but as we saw in that graph, it could be higher than that and varies for different groups. But I think to put that in the context of anti-poverty work, you know, this is 2 times the Scottish, or roughly 2 times the Scottish child payment, which is obviously a key plank of the sort of current anti-poverty measures, being potentially completely wiped out just by this additional cost around transport for people living rurally. So in terms of the Poverty Alliance now, policy asks, and I'll rattle through these, but we want a Scotland where we can all get to where we need. And, you know, that obviously requires an improvement to the affordability and accessibility of public transport, so all of us have the same freedoms to access essential services, employment and leisure. That needs expanding of concessionary travel further than I think is proposed in the Fair Fares review. It needs an integration of our transport systems alongside that expansion of concessionary travel to include all modes of transport, including rail, ferry and tram. And we need to make sure that public transport funding is directed towards networks which are affordable, reliable and safe and meet the needs of local people. And I'll just finish with something that is tucked away in some of the evidence that was published as part of the Fair Fares review, which is really worth looking at if you want to see something which sort of sounds and feels utopian, maybe to our eyes and ears, is the rural public transport system in Switzerland, and it's worth having a look at how amazing it seems. But the international evidence that the Fair Fares review pulls together is really clear that successful public transport systems with high levels of user satisfaction have a guiding mind. So something that somebody that oversees that system, and in particular has a focus on integrated timetabling and ticketing, and concessionary schemes that provide discounted fares for all modes of public transport and for a wider range of people than just age restricted groups. So yeah, hopefully that chimes with our policy asks in terms of the evidence there. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Ralph. I will open it up, but seeing as I'm in the chair, I'm going to go first. So a couple of questions for Bertrand, if I may. So Bertrand, you said that you were in charge of the team that is looking at the target to reduce car miles by 20%. So first question is, how are you getting on with that? Because we've not actually seen any concrete proposals. And the second question, on the flat fares pilot, when do we expect to know where that will be and when?
So to respond on your first question, just 2 weeks ago, the climate change monitoring report has, for the first time, expressed that this 20% car use reduction is off track for 2022. We have committed to publish the route map by this autumn, and we will continue to work with local authorities and regional transport partnerships to ensure that maybe the demand management side of the route map will be taken forward. The commitment done by Ms. McAllen on the 18th of April included a timeline for demand management, which for us means that we will provide a timeline of how such schemes could be put in place and how to get there. And the second aspect would be to ask the UK government to reform the motoring taxation. As I said in my briefing, the current system, especially with regard fuel duty, is disproportionate. Is not equitable. On the second aspect, I don't have the timetable to know when they will be able to report on this. I know it's part of the work they have started to do, but I could ask them if they've got some data and come back to you.
Thanks for that. I'll open it up now. Those of you who are online, if you could just put your virtual hand up and we'll try to get to you. We've got quite a bit of time, but I'd like to be finished by 8:30 at the latest. That's 7:30, not 8:30. So hands up if you want to speak, and if I call you in, if you could say who you are and where you're from. In the room first. Yeah, just borrow that mic.
I can sort of reach it. Hi everyone, I'm Ellie Harrison. I'm a volunteer with the Get Glasgow Moving public transport campaign, and I have been involved for the last 8 years and followed the transport bill through the Parliament. I'll try and make this a question. I don't know if there's time for wider discussion at the end. But we're incredibly frustrated about what seems to be a complete lack of urgency in delivering the powers in the Transport Act. It is really clear to us in our campaign and the other partners that we've worked with why we have this issue with transport poverty. It's because there's a complete lack of regulation over the bus sector, both the cost of the fares and the routes that are being provided. And there is mainstream acknowledgement of this around the UK now. We've got 9 out of the 12 mayoral combined authorities in England moving forward to regulate their bus networks. And earlier this year, Wales announced that within the next 2 years, the entire bus network in Wales would be regulated. So we're being left behind, and the latest that we heard from Transport Scotland is that the franchising powers, which would enable a transport authority like SPT to set the fares and to plan the routes so that they actually meet communities' needs, won't be fully enacted till the end of this year. And there is no money behind it to help SPT to deliver, to actually utilise those powers. So to try to make this into a question for Bertrand, and I mean, the Fares Review is laughable that you could spend 3 years to come up with a recommendation to develop a proposal for a pilot. That is really, really shameful. What we need is those powers enacted. We need the regional transport partnerships to be properly funded to be able to utilise them so that we can deliver a transformation to our public transport networks and deliver an integrated and affordable service for everybody in Scotland. So what are you going to do to help make that happen?
Sorry, before Bertrand answers that, you don't have to ask a question. You could just make a point if you want. And also, Bertrand is a civil servant. He's not a government minister, so he's not here to answer for the policy of the government. So just whatever you're comfortable with, Bertrand. We're not putting you on the spot here.
What I know is the regulation to allow all these powers about franchising and regulating will be led throughout 2024 alongside guidance expected in the autumn. So at this point, local authorities and, if they wish, regional transport partnership will have all the powers needed to transform the way public transport is operated
It takes
very
4
much like
years to
SPT.
deliver it.
But at least we are there. We are nearly there.
4 years to enact the powers, and then another 4 years to actually roll them out. So we're going to be at 2030 before we see any changes to the public transport network.
Ellie, that's not Bertrand's fault, but you've made your point. Right, we've got Chris Day online. That was a shock, wasn't it? You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Certainly can.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask 3 questions or 3 points?
No,
First,
can you just make it one, please? There's quite a bit of interest.
Pick the
best one.
Okay, let's go for Ralph then, and maybe I'll come back later. In your research, do you identify what is a reasonable fare for people to pay on a bus? And I know there's potentially, this is a complex thing, so try and keep it simple by saying a single one-way fare off-peak and on-peak. What's a reasonable amount for people that people think is a reasonable amount to pay for a bus trip?
Ralph, you got a view?
Yeah, I think there's a short answer to that, in that we didn't identify that, no. And I guess, as I said, I think yeah, what do you have a question actually? I think we could, but it could be something we could include in further work we do. But yeah, it wasn't something that we covered explicitly.
No, that's okay. I just wondered if you had. I mean, I wasn't making a point there. Yeah.
I suppose that could link back into this sort of flat fares pilot. What would the flat fare be? And I'm not going to ask you that, Bertrand, because we haven't decided yet. Right, I'll bring in, now you had your hand up. If you could say who you are and where you're from.
Thank you. Richard Gale. I'm a councillor for Highland Council, and I chair the Sutherland Community Partnership Transport Subgroup. My ward is East Sutherland, but I also chair the Sutherland Area Committee. So we have a severe transport problem across Sutherland, where there is virtually no public transport, and access to services is very, very limited. It also affects children travelling back and forth, because we have 4 school ASGs, and school transport doesn't allow them to participate in after-school activities, because they've all got to get their buses back home. And the other big issue is that we have no patient transport, so people are limited to get access to clinics. A clinic for somebody in central Sutherland in Inverness is a journey of at least 60 miles each way, and if you don't have access to a car, you don't have access to your health clinic. Patient transport is non-existent, and it's almost like a secret service. When we asked for details of what the criteria is to access patient transport, they refused to tell us, because it's if they told us what it was, then everybody would be after it. So, and when you phone up for patient transport, if you say you can walk to a car, then they say you don't need public patient transport. Now, if you go for an eye clinic in Inverness, and you travel down to Inverness to get that clinic, you can drive there, but you can't drive home. So by virtue, you're being deprived access to that clinic. Now, that's one of the issues. So that's one of the questions for Margaret, I suppose, is what's going to happen now to improve patient transport services and access to healthcare in rural areas where at the moment is severely depleted. I have other questions, but I'll go with the flow and just stick with one.
Well, thank you. That's a really good example of transport poverty, I think, and of the difficulty that people face because they're in transport poverty. I'm not here to represent Highland Health Board, so I can't really comment on the policy within Highland. I can say that when we've been doing a lot of discussion about transport poverty with colleagues, including NHS colleagues, and the issue of patient transport and transport to access health services has come up as a really big issue, and we've got there are people around the country doing various working groups to look at it, and there is a policy stream within Scottish Government that's also looking at access to health and the challenges of that. I'm not leading that. I don't work within Scottish Government, but there are colleagues that are working on that. So I don't think there's an instant answer to that, but there is a lot of work to try and understand and try and address it. And I completely agree with you. It is a really significant issue.
Can I just make one point on that, just to come back? Thank you. What's happening in Sutherland at the moment is there are a number of community transport groups getting organised and providing clinic cars, so to make sure that people can get, so we're driven by volunteers to get access to these services. And a group of councillors, myself included, we've set up our own company so we can access funding to provide that services. But there's no support coming from anywhere else to do that, and that's, to me, is a significant issue.
Thank you for that.
I suppose it'd be interesting to find out what the picture is across the country, not just in Highland, because there'll be other areas with similar problems, maybe not quite as bad. I think that's maybe a piece of research that could be done. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Yes, Sarah Boyack.
Thanks very much. Really enjoyed the presentation. And as I came here tonight, I passed a series of stalls in the main hall. And one of them was about the cost of living crisis. And it was from one of the groups in my patch in Fosside in East Lothian. And it's really interesting. Their survey results say that a third of women struggle to manage their transport costs, and 36% have had to make changes to other household spending to manage these costs. So I'll pass it in because it's really kind of useful evidence that backs up. And the thing about it that struck me is East Lothian has got access to some Lothian buses, and they are brilliant. I mean, it's £2 a journey, £4.80 a day. And it's an award-winning bus company. And it kind of goes back to the very first question, how do we get more affordable buses across the country? It's easier in cities where it's densely populated, but we absolutely need innovation in rural areas as well. And that means that then people can use their concessionary travel pass, which I introduced a million years ago, and there were a lot more bus services around. So there's something about how we get more bus services, and then maybe be innovative in other areas about people being able to use car clubs. I know in some areas that it doesn't mean that you travel every day in a car, but for certain journeys, it might help people in terms of different facilities they might need. So for me, it's like, how do we get more buses across the country that meet people's needs, and how do we just accelerate that process? Thanks, Graham.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to bring in Kate Samuels. Kate.
Hi, yes, so I'm Kate Samuels, Policy Officer at Sustrans. My question was kind of a thought relating to what we were talking about, and especially the Poverty Alliance presentation. So considering that, the people who are low income tend to use the bus to go to work, shouldn't we be thinking about kind of capping fare sooner rather than later, and potentially at £2, as was just mentioned there, and is also the case in some places in England?
That will be probably what the fares, the cap fares pilot will look at, and coming up to this level. Will it be £2, £4?
Kate, do you want to come back on that?
No, that's great. Just wanted to know whether it was being looked at. Thank you.
Well, obviously, we've heard there's no timescale yet, and we don't know where this pilot would be. But I mean, if I express a personal view, I've been talking about this for a long time now, and I think we need to get on with it, because we need to get the cost of public transport down, and also to pick up on Sarah's point, we need more of it. People need to be able to access it. Yes, at the back, next to Sarah.
Thanks. Robert Sampson, Transport Focus. Just to make a couple of points, we represent passengers south of the border as well, and the £2 flat cap bus fares went down very well. It's overall passenger satisfaction has increased because of that. And also our own surveys of passengers in Scotland and England, over 50% of bus passengers use the bus because it's the only mode of transport they can use. There's no other mode. They don't have access to cars. The rail network doesn't go where they want to be. Bus is the only one that is. And when you take away a bus service or cut the frequency and availability, it has a far greater proportionate effect than it would have other people, because it is their only access to jobs and education. So I think that's worth bearing in mind as well as we take this piece of work forward. Thank you.
And of course, there are some bus fares which are hugely expensive, particularly in rural parts. It's okay in Edinburgh where you do pay a reasonable rate, but that's not the case in all parts of the country. So I think if we're producing a report on this, we need to demonstrate what the bus fares are across Scotland and not just in the cities. Now, did this chap want in? Yeah, that's you.
Thank you. Aaron McHale, I'm here as an independent, and I thought the presentations for me personally were really valuable, particularly the one from Margaret. I've lived with sight loss my whole life, and so for me, I'm not able to drive. I can't drive. I can walk. I could cycle, but I might cycle into someone, so I don't cycle, or I might get hit by a car. And yeah, I am completely reliant on trains. I'm fortunate enough to live close to a train station, within a few minutes walking distance. But for me, the train is a lifeline, because to see my family, I take the train across to Fife. To access work, I take the train to Edinburgh. To visit friends in Glasgow or Edinburgh, I take the train. To go traveling anywhere, I take the train. So for me, that is such an important mode of transport. And so thinking about it from an accessibility perspective, and for people who are, who live with the sight loss or other disabilities, it's hugely important. And I think that's something where, if it wasn't for the train, I wouldn't have access to opportunities like work. For me, because of access to trains and public transport, I'm able to be a positive contributor to society, which is something that if it wasn't there, I wouldn't be able to be. And so, not so much a question, but just to give my own experience there. And I do wonder how many people in my position, without access to high quality transport, are potentially not able to be positive contributors to society, and also have, we know the mental health impacts of not being able to access work or friends or family. So yeah, just to thank everybody for the time and the presentations today. It was really, really important.
And thanks for coming. I know you've been before, but that was a really powerful point. And I think it's something that we should be picking up in any work we do. But you're very welcome, and your contribution is really appreciated.
Thank you.
I see David Prescott online. David.
Hello, thank you very much. This is one really about the Fares Fair review, and I had wondered whether to raise it, but the comments from others have made it clear to me it needs to be raised, and that is the reasoning for not including the rail network in the concessionary fares schemes. It seems to me to be incorrect, and not that there is a strong difference. I accept there's a strong difference between train and bus, but the bus concession also includes pretty much the whole of the coach network. And that means there's a lot of concessionary money going into coach operators now, and we're seeing a huge growth in the coach market in Scotland and new players coming in. So it strikes me as we really need to rethink, in the same way as Scottish Government does when it does an appraisal of public transport provision, not a particular mode. Because when you do an appraisal, you try to get a new station, and you always people try to fob you off with a bus service. It doesn't work like that. The train is probably in some places the only public transport mode that you can use. For example, between Inverness and Perth, coaches don't call at most of the stations. It's only the train that provides a good service intermediately. So I think I would like the group as a whole to really challenge Transport Scotland and their reasoning in the Fares Fair document. My view is that it is incorrect. Bertram might wish to comment, but he is an old colleague of mine, so it's not intended to embarrass him.
No, thanks, David, and good to hear from you. You are right that the Fares Fair review will not look at the moment at expanding the scheme to the railway network. However, as I said initially, you know, when we look at this flat fare cap, they will look also at cross-modal fares. So here, the railway network may be part of the scope of this cap fare.
Okay, thanks. I'll wait and watch with interest. That's a big challenge. Thank you.
Well, we all will, because that was a bit of new information. Well done, David. Anyone in the room? There's quite a few. I'm going to bring in John Mason at the back, and then I do see the hands up online.
It was really fine. For Dr. Douglas, you mentioned a couple of times the phrase car culture, and I just wondered if you could maybe expand on that and how we deal with that, because it seems to me, although that's not directly poverty, because a lot of richer, take Glasgow, where I'm an MSP, sorry, John Mason, you know, a lot of better off people are using, either they use the train rather than the bus, or they use the car, they want to use their car, even though there is very good public transport where they are. So it's this kind of mindset, and presumably that means because fewer people are using the bus, that pushes the bus fares up effectively. And if we could get more people, as I think happens in Edinburgh, more people use the bus, probably because it's the only way they can travel, that keeps the bus fares down. So, and we've had falling bus usage in the west of Scotland for quite a long time. So it's not necessarily just because the buses aren't there, it's people are choosing not to use the buses. So have you any suggestions how we deal with that?
Yeah, I think you started to define car culture very well for me. I think it's the assumption that the default mode of travel will be car travel, and it affects individuals who might think that car travel is, you know, as you say, it's a mindset. They don't even think of traveling by public transport because they just by default travel by car. But it also underpins a lot of planning assumptions and assumptions about the way that services are delivered. So we heard the example from Highland, for example, where it's assumed that people will be able to drive, whereas there are many people who don't have access to a car or couldn't drive for lots of reasons. So all of those things are car culture. It is this autonormativity is a kind of jargon for it, the assumption that the default mode of travel will be car. I think there's also something which you touched on, which is about sometimes bus services can be stigmatised in some places. I think a lot less so in Edinburgh, as you said, than in other places, and that can both be caused by car culture, but also feed into car culture. I think that's something which we definitely need to challenge. And I think the other thing you said that I completely agree was this kind of vicious cycle that you get, where if public transport services are less used, then they become often less frequent because there's not really enough not enough patronage to justify the service. So then becomes less frequent, and then it's much less good to use because you're having to hang around a long time waiting for the bus. So then it becomes used even less, and you get this kind of vicious cycle. And that means that the services are less viable financially to the operator, but also they're just less good for everyone. So I keep asking, at what point do we get to the sort of positive tipping point where we can increase patronage so that we get the opposite effect? And I think there's a whole lot of things that would drive that. But you asked what underpins car culture. I think there are many things. I think the car industry over the years, if you look at any, obviously car adverts are part of that, but lots of other marketing efforts. And historically, there has been a lot of emphasis put on creating an environment that supports cars and doesn't necessarily support other modes of transport. So that's part of it. But I think it is in the culture, and it is quite a challenging thing to challenge, but we absolutely have to, or else we're never going to reach the 20% car kilometre target. We're never going to address all of the many harms that are caused by car culture, one of which is transport poverty.
Could I add something,
Please.
Margaret? It's also not only just the transport issues, but land planning or other things like digital connectivity must take a look at breaking this car culture, or not breaking, it's a big word, but at reducing the reliance on car. What we want in the route map to a car use reduction is not stopping people to use their car, is to use their car less. And therefore, they need to plan their journey much more in advance than just now where they decide, let's go. Could I also rectify something I said, to Dave, because the fact that the railway fares won't be into the flat fare, it will be on zonal integrated travel. So I understand that they will pick up a zone and they will decide to reduce fares across the modes within this zone and see how it fares in terms of patronage. But it won't be a cap on the fares.
I think the cap was just buses, wasn't it?
Just buses, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Right, we have quite a lot of interest in the room and a lot online. So I think we will try and get to everyone. So if everyone can be brief, first of all, despite his shredder issue earlier, which I really ought to punish him for, but I'll bring in Dave Defoe.
Hi, thank you. I think the shredder's off now. Yeah, it's a point that I think it's important to bear in mind for the reports that you'll be producing. And thanks for the great presentations. Margaret, in her presentation, listed 4 groups who are most affected by transport poverty. That was low-income women, disabled and rural. But the point I'd like to make is that whatever you do in terms of improving public transport and sustainable transport for these groups is also going to benefit sustainable transport in general for everybody. And just to give you one little example from myself, I don't think I fall into any of those 4 groups, but I've never wanted a car. I live in Linlithgow, and when I need to go to the hospital, which is in Livingston, if I was going to go by car, I'd be there in about 15 minutes. If I was to go, I mean, this is not deep rural or anything like that. It's, quite a significant town going to another significant town quite near Edinburgh. If I get the bus, there's 1 bus an hour, and the journey, because it goes through all sorts of villages, takes an hour. So, by improving bus services, you'll be helping people to choose the bus rather than choosing car, because if you can get there relatively quickly. But if you've got a car handy and you think, oh yeah, I've got to wait an hour for the bus, then I may have to wait an hour at the other end after my appointment, and the journey itself is going to take an hour. So that's just the point, that improving sustainable transport in general helps all these groups, and vice versa when you help these groups through transport innovations, so you help the general move to sustainable transport. It's just a point rather than a question, I guess. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Dave. Thank you. Yes.
Hello, Alexandra Kazan from Moore Valley Housing Association. We're a small housing association with a number of sustainable transport projects. And my question is, to what extent are green transport options and net zero transport infrastructure conditional to the delivery of the work on transport poverty?
Before anyone answers that, tell us about these projects.
So we have a EV car club, which is available from a few locations. We have EV infrastructure as well as a free e-bike rental program.
Where are you based?
We're based in Fife.
In Fife. Okay, that sounds really good. Anyone want to pick up on that? Or shall we just go around the room and take some more contributions? Go for it, Margaret.
Yeah, I mean, I think I talked about spatial planning being a really big driver of transport poverty, and that definitely includes residential areas and the kinds of transport that can or cannot access, and the kinds of often very low density housing that we produce that then means it's much more difficult to provide public transport to meet those needs, for example. So I think EV car clubs I'm absolutely all in favour of. I'd also like to know how good the public transport is and whether you've sort of built that into the way that you've designed those developments, as well as what's available in terms of stops, and also active travel infrastructure. Are there good cycling routes? Are they safe? Do they go anywhere? All of those. Very often we build it, you build a new development, you build a cycleway, it doesn't actually go anywhere, but you've ticked a planning box. So and within our partnership, we often talk about trying to take a whole system approach to transport and not having a sort of battle between the modes, but think about the transport system as a whole and how do you meet everybody's needs. So it is thinking about all of the modes and trying to sort of move people up the sustainable hierarchy.
Thank you. Ken Haig.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Ken Haig from the Leave My Trail campaign. I just wanted to make a point of we're greatly welcome the off-peak fare trial extension, because it would have been rather embarrassing for £116 million to be spent on a railway to reinstate the rail service after 55 years, for us to only then benefit for a single month on getting the reduced fares. But thankfully they've now extended it for another period, another 3 months. It means we're now getting 4 months of the trial as opposed to everybody else who's getting 12.
Thanks, Ken. Are you having to disband your campaign, having succeeded?
No, we're not disbanding. We're actually continuing until we deliver what we set out to deliver, which was a reinstatement of a railway with two trains per hour. Just now we're only delivered one, so we'll keep going until we get the second train per hour.
Up at the end.
Thanks very much. Mike Connolly from Rock Road. We're a financial investor in rolling stock for trains and for buses. Thinking about this, we've got a lack of structure, I think, to what it is that we're trying to achieve here to reach our ultimate goal, and that's having fair fares. A lack of structure in the sense that if we walk outside this building, we've got a perfect structure and running a local bus service owned by Lothian Buses. We've got SPT who are bringing forward proposals to franchise the bus network in its region. But if we also look at some of the more developed English regional city authorities, they're all moving towards having a structure where they own the bus network and they regulate the bus network. They will set their fares and they will go to a franchising model where they'll distribute contracts to various bus operators. For us, in terms of wanting to bring financing into investment in buses, our investors look for certainty, they look for structure. It gives them the confidence that there is a benefit here for bringing good money into providing buses to improve a bus network. And then further down the line, those authorities that have that structure have the ability to be able to regulate their fares in accordance with what they believe is the right fare for their region. I think that's where we should be starting from a lot of this discussion, as to why don't we have a structure? Okay, powers have been granted to local authorities. Quite frankly, I don't think the local authorities in some cases are big enough to be able to deliver what it is that we're actually talking about here. And that's where I think the solution is to create structures across Scotland that actually can deliver proper bus.
Okay. And yes, I know, Ellie, you'll have views on that. You're thinking of your own area. Yes.
So Adrian Davis from Edinburgh and AP University is really picking up on the previous point about structure, because I think one of the things listening to all of this tonight, and this debate would have happened lots of times over in other local authority areas across the whole of the UK, is going back to the 1986 Transport Act, or the 1985 Transport Act, which was operationalised in October the 1st, 1986. And I remember that in Piccadilly Gardens in Manchester, watching the chaos of privatisation. Is that we have, in waiting to understand what we need to do, we have to undo some of the stuff that was done by the 1985 Transport Act, which was, as just said, the privatisation leading to a kind of each for their own approach. So we need to have a structured approach which gives investors confidence. So I think all I'm saying is we just look at history. You can go back to Beeching if you want and look at the privatisation and the cutting of branch lines. I'm not necessarily saying go back as far there, but do remember, and some of the younger people who may not have ever heard of the 1985 Transport Act, but it was the act which led to the demise deliberately by Nicholas Ridley and Margaret Thatcher, just to put a party point on it, of public transport in order to support the great car economy of Thatcher. So the point really is, let's remember what they did to undo it in order to understand what we need to do in putting back structure into the system to give people confidence. Thank you.
Well, we're trying to look forward here, not back. Yes.
Lawrence Marshall from Capital Rail Action Group, Edinburgh City Region, I guess we cover. Thanks very much for the presentations. I guess the ultimate in affordability would be free fares. And Luxembourg has gone down that route for a couple of years now. So I just wondered whether there's anything to be learned from their experience, not just in terms of modal shift, but in terms of bringing people who otherwise would have experienced transport poverty into a more productive lifestyle that they have in Luxembourg. It's a smaller country than Scotland, obviously, and more compact and perhaps less poor, I'm not sure. But I just wondered, also the German Deutschland ticket, which is now at 49 euros for a month, which seems fairly affordable, just over £1 a day, I guess. The experience of that, I know it hasn't really led to a modal shift, I don't think, in terms of reduction in car traffic, and be interested to see what the ScotRail off-peak fares. I know there was an interim report the other day there, but I'm more interested in the transport poverty aspects of it and whether there's any lessons to be learned from Luxembourg and Germany and other such schemes in Europe.
I think the Fair Fares review have looked at all these various schemes just to appraise what we could do in Scotland with what we've got budgetary-wise, etc. And I think it's unaffordable to do such scheme within the geography of Scotland compared to Luxembourg. But you're right. I've heard the German system has displaced people from bikes onto bus or rail rather than from their cars. So we need to not to completely see these schemes are a panacea, you know.
But the German scheme was brought in to tackle the cost of living. Well, that was certainly I think that was the main reason behind it. Not necessarily to get more people to travel, but it was to reduce the cost. Margaret.
Yeah, I mean, concessionary or free fares are one part of what we would like to see, but we all have to remember the other dimensions of transport poverty. So there's no point having, you know, free fares or cheaper fares if actually there's no service available. And one of the issues that we've seen with the concessionary bus travel is that there are parts of Scotland where the bus service is really not enough to meet people's needs. So they might be entitled to, you know, they might be under 22 or an older person who's entitled to concessionary travel, but it really doesn't benefit them because the service is just not there. So I think it's really important that we address all of the 5 dimensions of transport poverty, not just affordability on its own.
So there's a couple of hands up in the room, but Sheila Gilmore online, you haven't spoken yet, so I'll come to you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry my camera won't go on, which is probably a good thing from your point of view. One of the big things for us, I live in an island, I'm from Arran, and I'm here today with the Scottish Rural and Islands Transport Community hat on. One of the big things for us has to be connectivity. You know, you can have free fares, you can have lots of things. As Margaret said, we've got to make sure that the services are suitable and appropriate. We have a ferry service, which I'm not going to go into because you all know about that, but we have supposedly connected trains with that. Well, they don't anymore. They don't connect anymore. You know, an example is if you were getting the 7 AM ferry from Ardrossan, the train leaves Glasgow Central at 6:15 and gets you in at 7 minutes past 7. Well, the boat's sailed. Equally, if you're travelling from Arn and you go over to Ardrossan and you get to Ardrossan for 10 to 4, 10 to 3, then the train is actually left at 12 minutes to 3. You know, so we absolutely need all these different agencies to be working together to ensure that we get transport connectivity, because it's issues like that that drive people to using cars, I'm afraid. Sorry, thank you.
Oh, you don't have to apologise. It's a point well made. It's just about having an integrated transport system. You even earned a virtual round of applause from Ken Haig there.
Woo!
Yeah, well done. Right, again.
Thank you, Robert Sampson, Transport Focus. Just when I hear the talk about structures, it doesn't come with a health warning. I started working for British Rail back in 1981 when it was regional based. Then it went into business units. Then it was organising for quality. I've been constant has been change and restructuring, and I think you've got to have the right structures, but the starting point has not got to be the structure. It's got to be the definitions that Margaret outlined at the start about availability, reliability, affordability, accessibility and safety. If you get what the passenger wants at all levels and build the structures around that, that's the starting point. The passenger and the non-passenger, how do you get people out of their cars? Look at those and then get the structures to fit what passengers actually want. That's the starting point, I would suggest. Thank you.
And Sarah?
Yeah, very much agree with that. I think the other thing to add on to that is there's a geographical issue as well. So we've got areas where you don't have bus services, you don't have train lines, and it's how do you expand public transport services and think about what the priorities are. And I think councils have to be part of that process, and it has to be a discussion that is not just top down, but it's got to be regional and it's got to be local. So there's something about actually going back to the first principles about transport property, availability, reliability, affordability, accessibility and safe, and think about in different areas what are the key priorities where you need to connect people. And maybe that's something we could try and push for out of this piece of work that we're doing.
Okay, I see 3 hands up. I'll take the 3 and then we'll wrap up. So, Ellie.
Apologies when I spoke before because I didn't really understand the context of this meeting because I've only been to one before and I didn't realise how many meetings. This isn't my question because I'd like to make a point after this, but how many meetings feed into this report? Because I would be interested in contributing to more of them and joining the group if possible. I didn't know if that was an option. But yeah, just to refer to a piece of research that I hope that you looked at when you were doing your report that was published in 2022 by Philip Alston, who's the former UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, who's based at the New York University School of Law in the Human Rights and Privatization Project. And they were basically looking for global case studies of where privatizations of key public services have affected human rights. They wrote a report about the healthcare system in Kenya, and then they chose the bus system in the UK as the worst example of an extreme privatization and the impact that that's had on human rights and poverty. So if you haven't looked at it, I recommend it, and it should definitely feed into the report. It highlights that 1985 Act as the root cause of all of these problems, and it analyses what it promised and what it actually delivered, which was obviously falling patronage, increasing fares, and less people having access to a service. So I agree with the man from Rock Road who spoke earlier about the structure is essential to delivering this, and I think that there's a lot of duplication between what Transport Scotland is doing and what's happening regionally, which we need to get rid of that duplication because it creates more confusion and it wastes money. And I think the way forward is national standards. No matter where you live in Scotland, you should be paying the same to get on a bus. I mean, it's expensive to get a bus in Glasgow. It's £2.95 for a single on First compared to £2 on Lothian. But in rural areas, I've heard stories of people trying to get buses in Elgin, £30 for a single to get from Elgin to Inverness. And they're putting asylum seekers in Elgin on a budget of, I think, a few pounds a week. So that journey is just impossible. We have the structures. The regional transport partnerships are there in skeleton form. They were defined in the 2005 Act. All we need to deliver this is to re-empower those RTPs to be able to deliver integrated public transport in their regions. It's really not rocket science. Just look at how it's delivered in other regions across Europe. And Switzerland is the best example, as we've already highlighted. Look at the Zurich city region. It is a huge area, got Zurich in the middle, a massive amount of rural area around the side, and they're connected to the urban core because it's all controlled by a public body which plans and coordinates the timetables, the routes and the services so that they connect seamlessly. It's not rocket science. We can deliver it here, national standards, regional delivery.
Thank you, Ellie. That's you. And the chap next to you who was listening intently.
Yeah, thank you. Paul Tetloff from Transform Scotland. Just a few comments. Spatial planning's been talked about a lot, and yeah, it's been a disaster for the last 50 years. We've been going in the wrong direction, and the costs are more than has been described here. We've got degraded town centres now that we're pumping massive amounts of money in to regenerate, and we somehow don't understand how that's happened. It's obviously happened because of our town developments and so on, and where we've developed places. And I'm not convinced we've understood that properly. It still seems to be happening. It's still going on now. Just a comment in defence of the railway industry and David Prescott and the cap on peak fares. Uniquely, the railway is the only area of transport where you had to pay more to travel at peak times. Not in a car, not on buses, not anywhere else. So, honestly, it should never be brought back, the idea of peak fares. So, good luck to where we are just now. And finally, on this idea of modal shift and reduction in car use, Lothian buses are held up as a model. And yeah, they're a great bus company. But honestly, I know Sarah Boyd was on the call earlier and don't see her now. Oh yes, she is. There we are. They're so hammered by congestion in the city, and journey times are so lengthened. It's an inefficient way to try to run a really good bus service, and we've got to do something about reallocation of road space, and it's impacting on Edinburgh trams as well now. Delayed journey times on Edinburgh trams because we are not tackling reallocation of road space, and we'll never succeed with any of this unless we seriously do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And up at the top, and then I'm going to, if Sarah Boyd wants in, because she was mentioned, she can come in, but I'll take this chap at the top first.
Thank you, Chair. Just one point, a quick point for myself, is that the latest census has shown that we're suffering from a severe depopulation issue across a lot of the rural parts of the Highlands in particular, and access to services is one of the drivers for that, and transport is integral. If we don't improve the transport links, then that depopulation issue will continue, and we'll find that the last person to leave Southern can put the lights out. Thank you.
Thank you. And finally, Sarah, you're on.
Thank you. I'll keep it very brief, conscious of time. Yeah, thank you to Paul for those comments. I think very succinctly said. The one bit I would add to that is reliability. So actually, you know, almost that is the single most important thing. We, Lothian, always say everything else comes together, but if you don't have reliability, then actually people might choose to do make their journey, you know, by another mode of transport. And I think that the congestion piece cannot be underestimated in terms of the obvious link, straightforward, direct link that exists between congestion and reliability. And so actually tackling that allows for the passenger to have faith in the operator for a start, and also allows the operator then to be able to plan and, you know, to think kind of longer term strategy. So yeah, I would just echo the point about congestion. Thank you for the opportunity to say that.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Okay, I think we've had a really good discussion tonight. Can I thank our three speakers and everyone who's contributed. I should have said at the start there were some apologies from MSPs who were, funnily enough, out doing other things. Mark Ruskell, Brian Whittle and Katie Clark, who I think all wanted to be here. I'm just going to ask Colin to outline the possible themes for our next few meetings on this.
Yes, so some of you attended the last two inquiries that we held, first on traffic reduction, then on public transport decarbonisation. And they were quite sort of compact pieces of work with evidence sessions held quite close together than a final event in the report. This is going to be a bit, it's going to take a bit longer to get through this. We've now got a programme agreed with the MSPs running through, not through to this summer recess, but to next summer recess. So it's going to be 5 meetings in total. So today, first one, second meeting, probably September-ish this year, then November, March 25, and then a final closing event in May, June 25. So 4 further events, 5 meetings in total in this series. We're still to confirm the themes for the next 3 meetings, but it may well be disabilities, women and young people, which wasn't discussed much tonight. Perhaps that reflects the demographic of the group. So, but some of that is still to be confirmed with the MSPs, but approximately that will be the content. And the other point I was going to make is that, yeah, Transform will be advertising for a volunteer, probably within the Transform network, to assist us with preparing the notes of the meeting, the reports, the write-up. So Susan, my colleague there, has been furiously scribbling away, but we're hoping to find someone else to assist us with writing up the work and the report that we'll present at the very end of the process. So we won't take quite as long as the Fair Fares review, 2.5 years, but we are going to take a cheap shot. We are going to take a good year on this process.
Okay, thanks, Colin. And I will close the meeting and thank you everyone for attending. Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you. Do you know why this won't go off?